Valorant Franchising is going to be amazing for the top level of competition, the best teams in the world playing against each other on LAN week in and week out. For the players who made it, this is the golden opportunity to prove just how good they are on the big stage. But what about the players who didn't? One of the worst things about Valorant Franchising is the small amount of team slots, and naturally, that means some great players will miss out. I'm Commend, and these are the best players who didn't make it into Valorant Franchising. Subscribe if you enjoy, and let's do this. Across the 3 international leagues, the region with the least tier 1 free agents is EMEA. That's because the other 2 leagues are made up of several sub-regions. Take the Americas League, which is made up of 5 NA teams, 3 Brazilian teams, and 2 LATAM teams. This means the tier 1 talent in those regions has to be condensed into a smaller number of teams. For example, we're used to seeing 12 different tier 1 NA teams in challenges, but that now becomes 5, which we'll get onto. In the Pacific League, the same is happening. There's only 3 Korean teams in franchising, as opposed to the 8 they had before in tier 1. That means that a lot of players in those regions won't be picked up, simply because there aren't enough slots for all the players to fit into. In Europe, it's a different situation. The only major sub-region in the league is Turkey, which has 2 long-running teams who haven't made many roster changes. For the rest of EU, there are so many different countries that to try and build a roster for only one would probably give you a competitive disadvantage. This leads to the top players being spread out, and so any of the 10 teams in the league can sign pretty much whoever. As a result, most of the top players in EMEA have already been signed, but there are still a few players here from Europe. With that explained, let's get to it. There's a few different reasons why players may not have made franchising, but the first is that their team got in, but they just made upgrades. Fnatic have turned their roster into a super team by signing Chronicle and Leo for next year, but that means Mystic and Enzo will have to make way. It's unfortunate because Leo and Chronicle are definitely upgrades, but Mystic and Enzo are great players who put up massive performances at the top of EU for a long time. I think anyone who pulls off clutches like this deserves a spot on a franchise team.
A 1v2, swaps the weaponry around, the players are low, a single bullet on either of them, it might be enough, it could be enough. The horn dropped, positioning gained. And now that a few stuck down to half, he knows where the opposition is, he's sticking it! What an insane play from Enzo! Ice cold!
But there's currently been no reports of either of them joining a tier 1 team for 2023. We might see Mystic stay on Fnatic as a 6-man, though we could try and make it to franchising through Ascension, we'll have to see. Another team that made franchising but dropped some players is the revamped Sentinels roster, which only had room for tenz to stay. Before the signing of Sacy and Pancada, it seemed like dapr was going to be the one keeping his position on the team, but the roles would work out in favour of keeping an op player instead, so tenz was the obvious choice. dapr has consistently performed at a high level, even during Sentinel's disappointing year in 2022, and so a lot of people expected him to get signed by another franchise team. That doesn't look like it will happen, and you have to feel for him, with a spot in franchising basically secured to out of the team within days.
I got fucked out of franchising in CSGO, like quote-unquote franchising wasn't necessarily franchising. I kind of got the same end of the stick here.
But at least dapr wasn't the only player on his team to get dropped, a fate that came to Will from 100 Thieves. Will is a really solid entry player, and carried them in their only win at Champions, so you'd expect him to stay on the team for franchising. But 100 Thieves have always lacked a strong chamber player, and so when Cryo was available to sign, they jumped on it immediately. With Cryo coming in, Will was dropped, the only member of 100 Thieves to leave the team. I think that Will could have become a great player had he stayed on 100T. It's unfortunate that he won't be in tier 1 competition next year. But Will wasn't the only player in this position. Adverso, the former IGL for Leviathan, also is. He led the team to great results in Copenhagen and Istanbul, but with Leviathan signing Kesnet and Mazzino, he's the only player from the old Leviathan roster to miss out on franchising. Melter was also dropped from the team, but he's headed to Crew, so we'll see more of him next year. A player who I wish I could see more of next year is Meddo from G2. His old teammates have found spots in franchising on Giants and Team Heretics, but he's still looking for offers. I genuinely thought he was one of the most underrated players in Europe last year, especially on Killjoy, but with the rise of Chamber, traditional Sentinel players have gone down in value, and this could have hurt Meddo's chances to land a spot in franchising. Speaking of being left in the dust, BCJ is a prime example. All of the xeppaa players have been picked up, with Def and Zekken at Sentinels, Cryo at 100T and ayrin all the way over in India at Global Esports. Well, all of them except BCJ. Going into franchising, he was seen as one of the top initiators, at least in NA, if not the world, so in my opinion, he's one of the players that's been most snubbed by franchising. Surf knows how BCJ feels, with the Xerxia core getting picked up by Talon Esports is all celebrations for them as they reunite with Patapan for 2023. But Patapan's replacement for this year, Surf, proved himself as a really strong player too, but he didn't get a look in. It's a real shame, as he's honestly cracked, and the difficulty comes with only having one Thai team, so he misses out. Not all the players in this video have a tragic reason though, some are just simply great players that didn't manage to land a spot on a franchise team. Jojo was the initiator player for North Eption and put up some stellar performances domestically and in Copenhagen. Meteor and Zinfree from North Epsom were both signed for franchising, so it surprised me that arguably their second best player wasn't either. Boom are another team that have had 2 of their players signed, those being Tebotol and Flipstuder, both at RRQ. Another Boom player maybe should have been as well, Famous, who played a massive part in even getting them to champs through a stacked LCQ bracket. His Sova and KO play is some of the best in APAC, and I would have loved to see it again next year. Another player known for his KO is Nismo from Ghost. He was quickly becoming one of the best players in NA in Challenger Stage 2, and then Ghost fell off, but it was clear that he had incredible talent, from firepower to game sense to restaurant owning. I'm not surprised that he won't be on a franchise team, though it would have been amazing to see him up against the already established top players in the world. Sylvan was another up-and-coming player who pushed his team, WGS, to the upper echelon of Korean VCT. Impactful smokes players are extremely rare, but with DRX already having Mako, Genji looking to recreate TNL, and T1 deciding to just not sign a smokes player, it shut the door on one of the most promising players in Korea on smokes. And when talking promising Korean players, you have to include Lakia. He's been somewhat of an icon in Korea in Valorant over the past few years, seen as the next big star, but relegated to the bench on Vision Strikers. The promise of he could be the best player in Korea intrigued many, although it seems he won't get to show it next year as he's not being picked up by a roster for Sao Paulo. But arguably the most promising smokes player in all of Asia won't be in Tier 1 competition next year, and that's Scary from Xerxia. This wasn't just because he didn't get offers though, he deliberately chose to be in Ascension, and that's because he was offered a huge contract from Bleed, probably the richest org in APAC. Bleed have an extremely strong roster for Ascension with him included, and so we might see Scary in franchising next year anyway. Good contracts can make players want to move teams, but bad ones can keep them stuck where they are. That's what's happened to Babybay and Dicey, the star duo of FaZe Clan. FaZe didn't make it into franchising, but the contracts with Babybay and Dicey prevent them from moving teams yet, so we won't see either of them in Brazil next year, a disappointment for FaZe fans I'm sure. There's of course the argument that FaZe should have got into franchising anyway, but there's a bigger one for the guard in my opinion. Trent and Valyn are 2 players that get talked about a lot in this discussion, and I think they're definitely franchising level players. I'd argue that jonahp and net are too, but again, with the very low number of NA franchising slots, it's difficult to fit them all in. Sire player is headed back to T1 and Korea, but the guard will probably compete in Ascension with the remaining 4. If they'd have got into franchising though, there's no doubt that Trent and Valyn would be there too. With no Asian franchising slots going to China, Edward Gaming have been snubbed slightly too. After a dominant East Asia LCQ performance and solid showing at Champs, it would seem that they would fit franchising brilliantly, along with the already established relationship with Riot through League of Legends. I'm sure this won't be the end of their players, as Riot most likely has a different idea for Chinese Valorant, but it would have been hyped to see Chinese talent develop and grow along with the rest of the Pacific League. Finally, we have the player who probably got the most offers for Valorant franchising out of anyone on this list, but his reason for not being in Tier 1 competition next year is unique. Marved, probably the best controller player in the world, won't be in franchising next year, as he's decided to take a break. Uprooting your life to LA to play and compete in Valorant every day of every week is a huge commitment, so it makes sense for Marv to take the time he needs before dedicating to Tier 1 competition. It is a shame that we won't get to see him play at the top level again for a while, but I'm sure he'll make an emphatic return when the time is right. And so those are the best players not in franchising, but hopefully we'll get to see them in the Ascension Leagues next year instead. Let me know what you thought down below, and if you think I missed any players out. I've been Command, subscribe if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.